Hi everybody, and I'm doing something a little bit different today, as I seem to do every time I'm doing videos lately, which is a user by the name of the Man with the Great Machete had a request for me to look at a particular video and provide commentary. It's actually a pretty nifty idea. I understand where he's coming from. He's looking at the argumentation that I would use, presumably as an INFP, against someone who's providing, say, a very different line of argumentation. And so I will actually do I guess it's a reaction video to a user called MentisWave. And the title of the video is all about entitlements are not rights. Now, MentisWave presents himself as something like a neo-libertarian, rational thinker, something along those lines. And so that is, in some ways, whether or not we agree in positions, the way that we arrive at those positions will be fundamentally different, I think. So I've seen some of these bits and pieces before, but let's go through it. And if I do hit pause every once in a while on the source video, it's because I don't have I do have an ad-free YouTube account, but it's just complicated. So it'll probably be when there's an ad, I'll hit pause and then resume. So there may be some cuts in this video. So let's go ahead and take it away, MentisWave.
Hey internets, so the latest thing that people are freaking out about is SNAP food benefits running out, as a result of the continued government shutdown. For those few of you out there not familiar, that is just the food welfare program in the United States, which enrolls people into the EBT program, basically allowing them to get some free stuff as long as they meet certain criteria. Most of the time the criteria is simply being poor, but there are some loopholes around that, so it's a bit more complicated. But anyway, the problem here is that people are once again showing that a large portion of the population does not understand the difference between an entitlement and a right, with the common misconception being that food is a human right. And while on a very simplistic level, that might sound reasonable, because hey, everybody needs to eat, right? There's a lot of really serious issues that come up when you call it a right.
Okay, so I don't specifically disagree with anything yet here, but there is some stage setting involved in all of this. First, I would say this is not a place where I would want to have a debate. This is not fun for me. So diving into this is more or less, it's a chore, which I'm willing to take on because the output of argumentation is what's more interesting than the actual thoughts that MentisWave may have, or even the actual thoughts that I may have. It's more looking at the process rather than the content. I think I'm facing someone here who is both very polished, which I am not, and also is going to be able to string together thoughts without any clear transitions between individual, like discrete thoughts. So my suspicion is I'll have to just stop every now and then, and it'll be in mid-thought that carries forward to other thoughts, and so I'll be interrupting the stream and maybe preemptively saying things that go in a different direction or who knows what. But anyway, you get the idea of MentisWave's style. And while I don't disagree with anything fundamentally yet, that's because it's mainly stage setting so far. So let's proceed.
Because food benefits are not a right. Food benefits are an entitlement. What is the difference and why does it matter? Well, that's one of the things I'm going to go over in this video, but I'm also going to be refuting a common socialist false dichotomy using Voosh as an example. Yeah, I know, it's been a while since I refuted Voosh, but he gives a really good example of this particular bad argument.
Okay, so we know where we're coming from when we use words like socialist false dichotomy, and setting the stage to say that there's a difference between what is an entitlement and what is a right. So we'll find, how does MentisWave define these two different things? Does this align with the common definitions? And are there, is this all, does it pass the sniff test? So we'll see.
Another is explaining the problem with entitlements and how they pervert the concept of charity and caring for the poor into something actually quite hateful. And also how there's a lot of data that shows that the current status social welfare system is at the very least in need of some serious reform, due to some very serious, arguably intentional flaws. But first off, this is going to be another self-sponsored video.
Okay, couple of quick thoughts. He talks about a system that is hateful. Clearly, systems cannot be hateful. They are systems. So, once again, there's a lot of, let's say, tonal language that's being used to frame the discussion that I would say is not rational. So, as MentisWave presents himself as a rationalist, I find that there is language that's being used intentionally to signal that he falls on a particular place in the spectrum of beliefs. And I mean, nothing wrong with that. It just is something that is clear and needs to be pointed out.
I do happen to have a merch store. It's got some pretty good quality stuff, and profits really do help out the channel. And I'll also be putting the Taxation is Theft merch on sale for a little bit, because it is theft, and it's also one of the key issues that makes the distinction between what is a right and what is an entitlement. So a link to that will be in the description below. And let's get started with just that. What is the difference between a right and an entitlement?
Okay.
Well, rights come from the concept of natural laws, which are based on asking the question, who is the rightful owner of certain scarce resources? These are effectively laws that every sentient being understands is needed for society to peacefully function, since reality has scarce resources. For example, the fact that two people cannot occupy the same space at the same time, or cannot use the same resource at the same time.
Okay, right there, that's not correct. So first, about this idea of natural laws, yes, that's been something where we could go back to the philosophers of the time that say there are certain inalienable qualities that a civilized society should have. All good, but to say that two people can't occupy the same space in the same time, that is not an entitlement or a right. That's just the law of physics. As for two people sharing the same resource at the same time, it depends on what we're talking about with the resource. So, if, for instance, we have a commons, like a common grazing ground, that could be used by multiple owners of cattle or sheep or what have you, in order to utilize that resource. Or there are, well, again, it depends on what you're talking about with the same thing and the same time. But there are, I would say, relatively few things that physically can't be used at the same way, the same time between different people. But there's plenty of broader resources that can be used at the same time by multiple people. And so this, again, we're getting a lot of bias out of the gate. And this all just makes it sort of suspect as to the speaker being rational versus wanting to inflame the pathos of the listener.
Thus, for peace to exist, these conflicts must be easily resolvable and preferably avoided. Natural law fixes this by dictating that the one who first transforms something with, say, their own labor by their own will is thus the rightful owner.
I don't know that that's what, I don't think that's what you think it is. Natural law doesn't necessarily say the person who transforms a thing owns that thing. I mean, again, it's the case in certain things, such as a work of art, or in a manufactured good, but it depends on kind of the sources and the destinations. And so anyway, this is all a whole lot more complex and being presented in an oversimplified way. Understandable why, but I think this is in effect, I don't believe this is part of the discourse that historically philosophers have had about natural laws. But let's go ahead.
Whereas entitlements, on the other hand, are more like privileges. Privileges are something that requires external labor for somebody else to provide. So another way to understand it is kind of the positive and negative liberty thing. Rights are freedom from things, whereas privileges and entitlements are freedoms to have things. For example, a right would be the right to live peacefully in your home, free from some psychopath coming over to murder you, or freedom from someone coming and stealing your stuff. Those are examples of natural rights.
That's not really, I mean, it could be argued, but that's not really a position that I think makes, I mean, it makes emotional sense, but it doesn't make rational sense. And here's where I've looked up what the differences are between rights and entitlements. And as it turns out, rights are not necessarily entitlements are not necessarily rights, but all rights are forms of entitlement. And this definition of saying that entitlements are privileges that are given to you, like a handout, versus rights are things that are where the government defers to do things to you, is not correct in this example of saying, you have a right not to be murdered in your home. You have a right not to be murdered in your home by the government. But if somebody comes over and you need to have a police officer to defend you, or standing military to provide protection, those are entitlements. That is a government handout. That's a government program. Having the firefighters come to your house to put out a fire is an entitlement. You may want to have the right to be secure in your home, but that's just the freedom from government interference would mean that the government does not set your house on fire. To put it out, that is an entitlement. That is something where you're expecting to have an agency that's funded that will provide you with this privilege of dealing with a problem that happens to befall you. So this is all kind of merged together, and I find disingenuous to a rational conversation. But that's my simplistic view, that I'm poking away at stuff that people would rather just gloss over to say, well, of course it's understood. But if you're going to have a rational conversation, then let's have a rational conversation. This is conflating things that are different in scope. And that conflation it's disingenuous. Anyway, let's go ahead.
And so when you say that food is a human right, you kind of create a slight problem here, because that's not really a freedom from something, but rather it is claiming entitlement to something. So imagine a world where we say that food is a human right, and person A grows a potato, but then person B wants the potato, but person A doesn't want to give the potato they grew to them. Under natural law, the resolution of this conflict is pretty obvious. The first guy grew the potato, he gets to decide what happens with it. If he wants to give it to the second guy because the second guy is starving, sure, then he should be able to do that. But if he doesn't want to give his potato away, for example, say he needs it to eat for himself, well, then that's also fine, because it's his potato. And yet when you try to say this is an entitlement, that food should be a human right, you're necessarily creating a conflict here. You're saying that person B should be entitled to the potato just as much as person A.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's actually saying that. So the fallacies here, first off, is that we're not living in a world where there's just one potato. So this analogy doesn't really hold. Second, if there was a single potato, it's not being given from person A to person B. That all being said, I don't know that I have a counter argument for saying that food should not be a human right. I mean, that piece of it may be a whole separate discussion, a separate argument, but that's not the argument that MentisWave is backing here. He's kind of going into different nooks and crannies and using this kind of biased language to, as I see it, inflame the pathos of the situation rather than inform the logos of the situation. Anyway, on we go.
Even though they didn't do anything to grow the potato, which effectively means that you're giving green light to the idea of theft. And so this tells us a simple way to tell the difference between an entitlement and a right, which is that entitlements necessarily create conflict and contradiction with other people's rights. Because when you say food is a human right, then that means that the person who grew the food somehow doesn't have a right to the food that they grew, but the person who wants it does. But what about the rights of the other guy? It doesn't really make much sense. So when people say food should be a human right, what they're really saying is something more along the lines of farmers should be enslaved and forced at gunpoint to provide free food.
Well, clearly no one has said that. I would like to find the source for someone who said that farmers should be held at gunpoint to give up their food. It hasn't happened. Again, a lot of this is using hyperbolic language. I find it disingenuous. And it's not to say that there isn't a good argument to be made here. I mean, but the discourse we're having here is for entertainment purposes. It is not a rational analysis of the situation. And I think that should be pretty clear. Anyway, I could prattle on about this further, but I think you get the idea that I'm not giving MentisWave a lot of credibility, that he is arguing from a position that would convince in a rational manner, even though I think that there is a potential rational argument here to be made.
Or the grocery store clerk, or quote-unquote society at large, or in the Western world how it usually currently operates is that it's on the taxpayer's dime, regardless of whether or not the taxpayer wants to fund such a thing. And now the usual retort to this is that, but food is a human need, everybody needs food. And yeah, that's true, but then you're just confusing rights with needs. If two people need the same thing at the same time, like say both person A and person B are starving, we still need to have rights to decide who gets to have the potato.
Okay, well and good, but in the US, I don't think that there is not a single potato. In fact, there is an issue of food surplus given the trade unraveling that we've seen, the great agricultural powerhouse that the United States is. We have such an abundance of food that starvation is unlikely. If anything, there may be the issue of too much food, a separate issue, but one that the government also shouldn't necessarily step into. That's a whole separate argument. Let's not go there. Let's see. Again, the issue with this is that there's so much of a gish gallop. It's like, let me try to address these points, but for each one that I get to, there are perhaps two or three kind of biased ways of presenting things that get through. Overall, I just find that the credibility, based on what's been observed, this person is not coming in good faith to make a rational argument despite being presented as a rationalist.
But perhaps most importantly is the fact that you don't actually need food to be a human right in order to have a social safety net in order to provide food for poor people. Which kind of brings us to the standard false dichotomy whenever those of us crazy free marketeer libertarians point this out, is the accusation that we just want the poor to starve. So here's a clip from Vush showing this false dichotomy in action.
The Republicans are advocating on a platform more or less of open cruelty, let the poor starve. And because of that, the end to SNAP benefits, of course, funding went, ended on Saturday. They haven't really been treating that as the political nuclear bomb that it really is. But we don't want the poors to have those anyway. I've seen a bunch of Republicans on social media who have been essentially arguing that it's good the SNAP benefits have ended because it's good that people are suffering. If they can't pay for their food, they can't pay for their food, and that's that.
So yeah, pretty typical socialist rhetoric there, with this false dichotomy being that you have this false choice between either a socialist welfare entitlement system or the poor starve to death.
While some people may argue that, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. once again, it seems to me like there's just a lot of this argument is not being made in good faith. Let me go back, because he keeps coming across some pieces that I want to comment on.
Because it's good that people are suffering. If they can't pay for their food, they can't pay for their food, and that's that.
So yeah, pretty typical socialist rhetoric there, with this false dichotomy being that you have this false choice between either a socialist welfare entitlement system or the poor starve to death. That unless you are in favor of socialism, that must mean that you just want the people who can't immediately afford food to all just starve.
Yeah. Another point being, or let's return to the point that there is an overabundance of food in the United States. And in fact, the government has a lot of agricultural subsidization that is helping to grow that excess food. So it seems rather funny that on the one hand, the government is created a system where it's paying out for agriculture to overproduce in abundance. And in some cases, I've heard of farmers being paid not to farm, but we are producing an overabundance on one hand, and then on the other, we would deny that food be brought to poor people, because that would be unseemly somehow. Again, I don't know that there may be a good argument to be made in here somewhere, but to focus in on this particular piece of benefits when it is a relatively small piece of the budget, when we have entitlements such as defense, such as, let's say, healthcare, which is its own issue, education. Basically, there's a lot of the national budget that goes into what all could be considered socialist entitlements. I mean, anything that where the government is providing a service to the people is arguably an entitlement and therefore socialism. So public safety, protection are as socialistic, infrastructure, education, as socialistic as this SNAP EBT program. And for some reason, they don't get the same level of attention by these sorts of commentators. I don't think we will see MentisWave making a video discussing that the Defense Department and the military should be entirely dismantled because it is a program that that's unnecessary. We should all be able to work on a privatized system of protection, given that we have the Second Amendment. Or is it well, anyway, given that Americans have the right to bear arms, why would we need some sort of a paid military force anyway? But we don't see that argument being made. So let's go ahead.
Very typical false choice there, because of course there are ways to make the poor not have to starve that are not based on socialism. Because the problem with entitlements or viewing food as a human right in this particular context is that it's an issue between involuntary welfare systems and voluntary welfare systems. That's the third choice that's being ignored here. The possibility of a welfare system, but people voluntarily put money into it. Like, for example, a community mutual aid fund.
Okay, I kind of like the idea of a voluntary system, but I think this idea may be better off broadened to be generally to the entire tax base. So, for instance, wouldn't it make sense if I were able to, if the government were to decide how much I owe in taxes, but I would be able to allocate where that money goes. And if we were able to do that collectively, every taxpayer could determine that, yes, I owe this percent of my income, but I've decided that I would like to give it to these following government causes. So I'll put it all into, say, environmental protection, or put good chunks of it into things like SNAP and EBT and subsistence programs for the poor. So I don't think that MentisWave is wrong here. I think it's being presented in a very tilted way when we could actually open up the discussion to something that's much bigger and universally applicable instead of being applied selectively to this SNAP EBT program.
There's a grocery store nearby me that actually recently started one up. Things that allow people in the community to voluntarily help each other, as opposing forcing somebody else to help. Socialists love to equivocate between these two concepts, the concept of entitlement and charity, in order to try and make themselves look like the good guys. Because, everybody likes Santa Claus. He comes once a year and gives all the kids a bunch of free stuff. And everyone's happy and it's joyful, etc., etc. And that's the kind of optics that socialists are going for.
Yeah, all of this talk of socialists, I don't actually know that there's that many socialists around here, at least not in titles. So, again, this is just use of inflammatory language to point out that there is an enemy out there somewhere. And this is not the case. We're all allowed to have our opinions. So I think that MentisWave is doing, in that respect, a valuable service, that his voice is being heard. And I think that, and there is a point that can be made here. But again, I don't think that he's doing the best way of making it by presenting it in such a biased fashion.
They want to be viewed as the heroes just bringing the people the things that they need to survive. But that is absolutely not what socialists are actually advocating for. They're advocating for an entitlement forced welfare system rather than a charity-based voluntary welfare system. And if you look deep into socialist theory, you'll find out that they actually at many points admit this. They don't like the concept of charity because it hurts their ability to sell socialism. And so the whole sale of entitlements is just one big gigantic grift.
Yeah, I'll just point out here that there is a lot of this they, these socialists, as if there's a monolithic aggregate hive mind that is all set on this specific agenda, which is absolutely not the case. There are maybe a lot of people with differing opinions and a lot of what MentisWave would see as bad opinions, but I don't see them as being a monolithic force in that regard. That they do each of these specific things. I would also point out here that the way that the framing is done by MentisWave, which I also find interesting, is that from the potato discussion onward, it's this discussion of scarcity and others are getting things that you're not. I think that these are ways to try and trigger selfish genes in order to say there's not enough for all of us to share and the other people are getting something that you ain't. Therefore, this whole situation is inherently unfair and you need to claim your own piece of this pie, that you need to reclaim what is rightfully yours. This is the framing that that would be set to make this sort of argument most effective, as opposed to the broader truth that there is an abundance through government subsidy. There's a level of complexity to all of these systems that makes them far more complicated than talking about single potatoes. And the system is simply not set up in such a simplistic way, and there's an overabundance available to us, and we need to work within that frame to figure out how to do what's most effective. And we haven't even talked about whether or not it's a good look to risk having people potentially starve in the street without government largesse, because charity may provide, but it may not provide everything, and then what? So let's go on.
Because obviously those of us advocating for a charity-based social safety net, or at the very least mutual aid-based social safety nets, or even insurance-based social safety nets, those of us advocating for these alternative systems are not actually against social safety nets. We're not saying let the poor starve, we're saying that involuntary forced welfare systems are inherently dysfunctional and lead to contradictory incentives, such as politicians designing the system to create permanent dependence instead of actually incentivizing people to get out of poverty. And that's just the start of the problems. Because a lot of people out there, they might look at this and think, okay, well, it doesn't really matter because people need to eat. Food is a human need. So as long as there is a social safety net of some sort, what does it matter if it's a public or a private social safety net? What does it matter if it's an involuntary system or a voluntary system? So long as people are getting food on their plates. And the answer is that when you have it be an involuntary system, a forced system, a rights-based system, you actually end up creating a lot of unintended consequences. And to prove my point, for the rest of this video, I'm going to go into what those consequences are. The first of these being that entitlement-based systems lead to the people, well, becoming entitled. You see, rather than being thankful for the food that they are receiving via a charity or a voluntary system, or being grateful to their community for having a mutual aid fund or something, when you have it be an entitlement system, since entitlements at their core are really just rooted in theft, rather than being thankful for what they're receiving for free, they instead view it as a civil rights victory, as a right that they fought for, and so they deserve this free stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that we can see the pathos bias here. Interesting thought that is one required to be grateful in order to receive assistance? Or if one does not express gratitude, are they not, should they not be assisted? I would say keep in mind that not only is this a rather tasteless stereotype that isn't necessarily, that isn't true. It's their poverty goes across, cuts across all ethnicities. It cuts across basically all of the American structure. I don't want to get into a broader argument here, but this is giving people subsidies for food is not specifically about helping just those people and the gratitude that they need to express. First, poverty and people who are poor because of a mixture of, there could be mental health issues, there could be bad choices, there could be family situations, extenuating circumstances, physical, mental disabilities, things like that. So it isn't necessarily the case that people who are receiving food subsidy are going to be grateful in every case. These are not necessarily people that are behaving rationally. Does that mean that they do not deserve, quote unquote, to receive food? That's kind of a separate conversation from whether one would express gratitude for these things. The corollary to all of this is that food assistance isn't just for the direct recipient, but also for indirect recipients. So, for instance, you may not want to feed the adult, but if that adult has 2 children, it makes sense that providing food benefits that feed all 3 of them, because the children are in a situation that they're not of their choosing or not of their creation, and they do need to be helped. It is kind of the least bad outcome. So it is perhaps in this neo-libertarian's counterweight that this is a necessary evil in order to not create a potential for greater evil.
And so when people go to use their EBT card, say in the United States again, Rather than being grateful for living in a rich country that's able to provide them with this, it's instead viewed as a right, that they deserve this card, with a nice big middle finger to the people who are net payers into this system. And this mentality is a lot more common than you think. If you look up people just complaining about EBT benefits not going through this month, this mentality of gives me this now, you owe this to me, seems to unfortunately be more of the norm rather than the exception. And this is what I mean by what I said earlier, that entitlements pervert the concept of charity and
Yeah, I'm seeing again some specific bias in. I don't think this is a coincidence. The faces that were seen going by here. So, well, once again, I think it just shows that MentisWave gives the appearance of speaking from a rationalist perspective, and some of the arguments on the surface of it are rationalist, but the agenda is pathos. It is to inflame the emotions of the listener. And I mean, there's something to be said for that approach, but to fold that into or present it as a rational argument is disingenuous.
turn it into something that is very hateful and spiteful. Rather than the man receiving the potato from the man who created the potato, giving thanks to him for being kind to his fellow man, in an entitlement involuntary system like this, now it's more of a highway robbery. So instead it's viewed as, you owe me this potato. You owe me this money, because you just do. And once you've given that kind of behavior the green light, you create a really weird thing where it leads to this very obnoxious slippery slope where people start to think of everything as a right. Because then it's less based on what people need and instead based more on equality. So for example, a common one I've seen is that socialists have been trying to say that DoorDash should be a human right, because it's apparently not fair that it's only the people who can afford the delivery of DoorDash can have food delivered to them from the...
I don't know that there is any substantial political movement to make food delivery a human right. So I think that someone somewhere said this who therefore is a socialist is not really a legitimate argument.
Their local finest restaurants. Oh no, that's not fair. Everybody should have that right. And I've seen a lot of liberals laugh and criticize the commies for saying things like this as well. Because of course that's absolutely ridiculous. A service like DoorDash can't be a human right. I mean, what if nobody wants to do it anymore? Are we going to start forcing people at gunpoint to start doing deliveries or something?
This guy has a real enjoyment of talking about forcing people to do things at gunpoint. I mean, for the rare number of times that that sort of thing actually happens in the US, it's already come up, twice? Well, there you have it.
It's ridiculous. But what people don't realize is that that is actually just the logical conclusion of what happens when you give in to the communists' first claim. When you've accepted that whatever they want or claim that they need is a human right, then they're just going to keep asking for more and more quote-unquote rights that aren't actually rights at all. That is the problem that happens when you don't just reject the whole concept on principle. And so that's just another reason why there needs to be a very thick line between what is considered an entitlement and what is considered a right.
Yeah, just a note, because we've now gone from socialists to communists or commies. And once more, this is not a monolithic, say, major political party inside the United States. Therefore, it is one of these throwaway words just to smear, and that's clearly the intent here. I would say that MentisWave identifies with the libertarian movement. I wouldn't call him a fascist, for instance, because there is no monolithic fascist movement, so I wouldn't be talking about that the fascists are doing this and that. Some people do talk in these tribalistic terms. It is simply not helpful. So let's go ahead.
Because if you don't, then eventually the commies are just going to say that everything should be their right. And then on the flip side, these mandatory welfare systems, in addition to making the receivers feel entitled, it also breeds resentment within net payers of the welfare for the people who don't want to be paying for it, but are forced to pay for it anyways. For instance, much of the rest of Vosh's video was him just going over various clips of people making fun of people on EBT and his audience lamenting about how all these people are demons and such selfish, greedy jerks. So just like there are people out there who think they deserve welfare and are acting entitled to it on camera, there are also people making fun of the people acting entitled in bad taste. But the thing that socialists don't realize here is that this is just another expected outcome of involuntary welfare, because it's not charity, it's theft. Roughly 12% of Americans are on SNAP, so what the state is effectively doing is just stealing from the 88% of the population that is not on SNAP and giving it to the others.
Yeah, that's not what's happening here, because once again, there is an overabundance of food that has been subsidized by government in the first place. And granted, that is also arguably a broken part of the system. Therefore, should all of this then, it's like arguing that one piece of an entire system is the singular bad piece. It doesn't seem to make sense that when there is an overabundance of things to then unilaterally deny that overabundance to people. I mean, there is an argument that can be made here, but it's not the one that MentisWave is making. Instead, he's just turning a blind eye to that stuff.
Now, when it comes to charity and actually voluntarily giving to people who are less fortunate, well, that usually makes people feel good because they're voluntarily helping someone in need. But when someone's stealing from you, well, it's a completely different story. And that's why you see all this resentment. And pretty much anybody could figure this out if you just think about it for a few minutes or so. Imagine if your neighbor living next door to you needs some food and you decide to voluntarily give him $20, versus imagine if the neighbor broke into your house and stole your money. I mean, you're obviously going to have a very different feeling about those two different scenarios. And so that's why we're seeing so much negativity surrounding this subject. Anyways, the next problem is the welfare trap. Because one very interesting difference between private mutual aid funds and
I think I'm going to wrap it up there, because I think after this it becomes a lot of more of the same, and then there's some studies that are cited, but the studies themselves are, of course, those that align with the particular positions that MentisWave takes, which, I mean, nothing to fault that. But one of the pieces that he does get into, just as kind of a final thought, is the need for reform and the complexity and the brokenness of the system. And, well, I'm in agreement with all of those elements, that there is a need for reform across numerous government agencies. The issue being that these agencies, the regulations, the programs are all built by consensus, by large groups of people, and by many different, say, commercial interests that conjoin with political interests. So the focus on the scale, on the social part of it, on the civil and the human part of it, it's a finger on the scale when there's actually multiple different forces that are all at play here. There's, for instance, the food companies, I think, are not too upset that the government is giving money and benefits so that people can go and buy food. That helps prop up the agribusiness community as well. So the problem is not so much that the system is broken, it's how does one legitimately and practically address that and fix it? And here, all of this kind of abstract discussion of what's wrong kind of fails to deal with the realities of the ground of how to fix a broken system when it has to be done by large group consensus, regardless of, and that large group consensus needs to not conflict with legal and regulatory tools. And, it's basically, our democracy is set up by committee. It's set up by groups of people, all with mutual interests, and resolving their conflicts of those interests. And that results in some pretty wonky stuff happening. And so we get the sort of government that is large and unwieldy and overly complex. And if we could redesign it, we probably should. But we would all disagree on how best to redesign that government. So we end up continuing on with a broken system as it is because of the inertia of this political dichotomy, of this us versus them. This just creates bigger rifts and makes things more impossible to do. So MentisWave, I'm afraid, is in this sense part of the problem, because he comes to the table with very specific, very strident views and what sounds to me like a disinterest in wanting to compromise. So probably not the sort of person that will ever go into politics. If one were to go into politics, probably not the sort of person that is going to be effective in that area. But anyway, I should go back and say again, I don't like political arguments. And really, I guess I could have gone to Vosh and whatever he was doing with his stuff and made a counter-argument to whatever positions that Vosh had. But this was the one that was suggested to me, and I think there's a lot of interesting material here. And I do think that MentisWave has got some good points. It's just that he's not making them, he's not going directly into the points and addressing them in a way that makes sense. Instead, he's going into this with his own ideas of how to, or his own angle and bias that he's trying to project to inflame the emotions of those people that would listen to this, all of whom can feel good that they're acting rationally while there's really an undercurrent of an emotional, say, selfishness that has been prodded. So that's all I've got on this. I'm sorry to make people sit through this. It's probably painful, but I will come up with something more interesting to say next time. Again, thanks for listening. I hope this is in some marginal way useful. Bye for now.